31. Donut Disappoint Me. New Amsterdam and the Dutch, Part 1. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll begin looking at what New York was before it was New York, and how the Dutch food traditions played a big role in creating the separate Yankee food identity in the New England colonies. I'll get to why we ditched sweet biscuits and have cookies in America. I'll also begin my case that someone needs to write an alternate timeline series of novels where the British lost more naval battles to the Dutch. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know: before the British set up their investment scheme of Chesapeake colonies in search of gold and jewels, or the enclave of righteous yet unskilled colonial farmers in New England, the Dutch had set their own sights on trading with the Lenape and the Sawant or Mohican tribes who inhabited the lands around the river that would soon be known as the Hudson. They saw that area as an excellent source of furs, and that the island of Manhattan would make an excellent trading entrepot for fish, furs, timber, the sugar from the Dutch Caribbean, as well as a spot for exploring the possibilities of this intriguing Chesapeake leaf, or what the world now calls tobacco. Henry Hudson started as an English sailor and ship's captain, but after a couple of failed attempts to find the polar passage to the east for the Muscovy Company of England, he switched employers and went to work for the Dutch East India Company. Instead of a passage across the pole, a simple northwest passage under Nova Scotia would do. In 1609, he sailed his ship, the Half Moon, up the future Hudson River. The Low Countries, or the Netherlands, had followed the lead of the Portuguese into many global trading ventures. To float their growing global trading ventures, they were always in search of timber for ships and more desirable luxuries to trade. Central Asia had provided the base for their trade in fancy flora. India was their textile shop. The Malay archipelago became home to spice riches as both trading partners and home to Dutch spice plantations, and East Asia proved a hub for trade in ginger and porcelain, until the Dutch established their own ceramics industry. Sugar and slaves would be available in different places bordering and dotting the tropical Atlantic Ocean. In pursuit of luxury trade items, the Dutch set up numerous fortresses and missions in all these locations. Some of them were more or less diplomatic, and others were simply military installations. Such activity was entirely typical of all the Western European powers scouring the world for new goodies. Generally, because the Dutch were working with a much smaller population, the size of their ventures tended to be smaller and leaned more on diplomatic than military solutions when determining policy and in the face of crises. The Dutch, with a long history of ingenuity and a large portion of the population involved in trades on and around the water, they were well on their way to snatching the global trade crown from the Portuguese. Because of history reasons, the Dutch suffered from a perennial lack of farmland and a limit on local natural resources generally. As a result, they were always on the lookout for somewhere to set up some nice farms with nice cows and some land to grow a nice amount of grain. Preferably somewhere they wouldn't have to reclaim the farmland from the sea 1 square foot at a time and continuously defend their efforts by shoring up dikes and pumping water out of their rigorously maintained ditches. The tropical and equatorial fortresses and outposts, while great sources of riches and trade goods, were not the farmland they were looking for, partly because the climate was all wrong for the cows they wanted to raise and the crops they wanted to grow, and partly because the land around the equator was often very occupied. So the Dutch land speculators were also on the hunt for land that was both unoccupied, lightly occupied turned out to be acceptable, and temperate. In the end, large numbers of Dutch colonial farmers set up Dutch farm shop in 2 main locations: South Africa, where solid examples of Dutch farms, language, and culture remain and are easy to identify, and in our area of study, New Amsterdam, on the southern tip of the island of Manhattan. While the Dutch language spur of Jersey Dutch largely died out before the 20th century, American English has heavily borrowed and happily absorbed Dutch words, just as it did with just about every other language it encountered while settling over the North American continent. While the settlement of New Amsterdam only existed officially from 1624 through 1664, foundations were laid with early fur trapping posts beginning with the 1609 voyage. When the English took over and changed New Amsterdam to New York as part of the settlement for a series of sea wars, Dutch farmers had already firmly established themselves along the Hudson Valley. These soon-to-be American Dutch would be immortalized by Washington Irving in a series of memorable tales over a century later, and their influence would continue to be felt as their descendants occupied the presidency multiple times. And it is this New Amsterdam, New York, Hudson Valley area that I will be looking at. Over the next couple of episodes, I'll explain how 17th century Dutch food traditions became one of the structural pillars that underlies much of what we now fuzzily think of as American food. Unlike the English, who regarded settlement of new lands as primarily mercenary ventures, with farming being a necessity that surely people could figure out somehow, the Dutch understood that planning farms and provisioning logistics were as important as planning fortresses and financial speculation. As with military adventurism, the Dutch worked with the understanding that human labor was an essential part of their world empire. They had limited human capital to invest in any venture, so it needed to be as healthy as possible, well-fed, and well-supplied. As a nation that has had to meticulously plan all land use due to their significant land reclamation schemes, the Dutch definitely went into the New Amsterdam venture with land use, staffing, and diplomatic plans. The colony of New Amsterdam purposely recruited and imported farmers, livestock, and engineers to design and build streets and drainage ditches. The colony planners recruited butchers, bakers, brewers, and a large variety of craftsmen like coopers, blacksmiths, tanners, and other leather workers, along with the trappers, saloon keepers, sex workers, and adventurers that were always willing to come along for ventures like these in search of profit and legendary status. Along with people to pursue trades, shipping contracts and financing were set up to provide startup capital and have shippers ready to pick up furs, timber, and fish, and be ready to trade necessary items like dishes, millstones, cloth, seeds, aquavitae, and brandy. Because setting up trading entrepôts and financing were already a national strength, the Dutch not only had wheat bread, glazed ceramic plates, cream, brandy, and beer almost right from the start, they tended to have access to luxuries like lemons, sugar, ginger, and cloves at a much earlier date than the British Atlantic colonies did. As a global trading powerhouse, the Old Amsterdam was a polyglot cosmopolitan city. Languages from all over Europe were spoken there, along with things like Yiddish, Arabic, and smatterings of Indonesian and Indian languages. Unlike most of Europe, which was busy splitting hairs over what kind of Catholic you were or whether you were Protestant enough without being too Protestant, the Netherlands generally welcomed any religious affiliation as long as you didn't get insistent, at least locally, about how your religion was the rightest one and everyone else better get in line. Professed atheism could be a bridge too far, but as long as you expressed affiliation with a god, the Dutch had little interest in regulating that relationship or which god you meant. The Dutch history of international dealing meant determining who was granted a full slate of human dignity was much less lightly tied to religious affiliation than it was in much of the rest of Europe. And as skin color and country of origin began to matter for determining worthiness for human dignity, the Dutch again had very different rules than most of the rest of Europe. They absolutely bought into class distinctions and sex segregation, though they were more willing to see both of these dividers as porous by reason of education and sheer effort. In fact, education and industriousness were seen as the way to success, and tended to be the two pillars in the social welfare system that existed in the 17th century Netherlands. Orphans were not only to be raised, but would be turned out into the world with a skill and fit to work. Proper nutrition as well as education were important. A fair bit of ink was spilled on ensuring that children were fed proper diets of grains, dairy, fish, and pickled vegetables, along with getting an education in either seafaring for boys or needlework for girls. All of this history is here to explain that while early English efforts at colonization were rather sloppy, expensive, and haphazard when it came to spending lives of both early colonists and the native North Americans, the Dutch went in for a tidier and more planned approach. The Chesapeake and Plymouth colonists had no or very vague plans for farming and both depended heavily on local tribes for food. When these plans turned out to not work so well, colonist deaths ranged between half and 100%. And once successful colonies were established, the early generosity of just about every tribe was met with overhunting and outright land theft, along with very aggressive military action to wipe out villages to simplify settlements. The Dutch, like the English, were absolutely willing to set up plantations, buy, sell, and transport enslaved Africans and Native Americans, and claim land by setting up military forts. After all, Wall Street in Manhattan is the location of the wall New Amsterdam set up to cut that end of the island off from the original local inhabitants. Unlike the English, the Dutch were much more interested in setting up long-term treaty relationships that would continue for years with formal exchanges and land access rights. This habit in diplomacy and relations was shown in several ways in both Dutch and English records. While land was quote-unquote purchased from the Lenape people for ridiculous legendary sums of beads, the arrangement was much more nuanced and complicated. Access, seasonal residence, fishing, and hunting rights were retained by the Lenape people. Elaborate agreements can be found in 17th century Dutch documents. Diary entries talking about the arrival of hunting or travel parties on land farmed by Dutch families and the need to host, feed them, and exchange gifts are recorded. And many an Englishman who purchased land from a Dutch family would be dumbfounded to discover the deed included obligations of hosting and gift exchange. Incidentally, the English tended to end these elaborate courtesies in favor of armed conflicts. So while the Dutch had largely peaceful, if complex, relationships with the native inhabitants, the English often found themselves in the midst of aggressive conflicts that often resulted in deaths on both sides. Like the 17th century English colonists, the Dutch colonists were not good hunters. Yes, they had experience in things like trapping, but that's a different skill set. Unlike the English, the Dutch rarely or never aspired to be hunters. Sure, they shot, netted, and snared wild birds, and they gathered mussels, oysters, and crabs, and fished everything, so those appeared on their tables. But living as they did on an intensely farmed nubbin of northern Europe, the Dutch had no particular fondness for or history of the fair chase. Deer, wild hare, and boar played almost no part in their cuisine. Farmyard fowl, like chickens, turkeys, and geese, caged rabbits, oxen, pigs, and goats, and occasionally horses were much more typical of the Dutch farm table, alongside the fish, shellfish, and wild fowl. By the late 17th century, the Dutch had largely opted out of growing much grain, trading dairy products and fish and eels for it from areas better suited to that sort of farming. Dutch weather and farmlands were better for growing mostly root vegetables and hardy greens, things like coleworts, which are basically cabbages and kales, radishes, turnips, beets, carrots, parsnips, and kohlrabi, onions, and cauliflower were all typical. The intensive farming practices meant that orchards of apples, cherries, pears, berries, and plums would also be set up, and the careful cultivation of these orchards and the development of varieties was part of the horticulture tradition that Dutch colonists brought with them to the New World. During this golden age of the Dutch Empire, it was not uncommon for the prosperous middle class, along with the fabulously wealthy, to incorporate imported spices like mace, ginger, cardamom, cloves, and peppers, both black and long, into their main dishes and sweets. And they would use local cold weather herbs like dill and caraway when they couldn't. The cool weather of the Netherlands also meant imported citrus had a pretty good shelf life, so bitter oranges and lemons were popular luxury items, along with things like tea, coffee, chocolate, sugar, and almonds. When it came to beverages, the Dutch did drink some water, but the fact that streams and wells had a tendency to produce brackish water meant that beer, wine, brandy, and Genever, or the precursor to gin, were popular beverages along with milk and buttermilk, fresh, boiled, and clabbered. Unhopped small beer, made for daily consumption, was widespread, but strong beer and wine were generally found only in fancier places, since they required grapes and hops, both imported items, and they typically needed cellars for storage. Due to the close relationship the Netherlands has with the sea, underground storage cellars are noticeably absent from most Dutch dwellings. The Dutch, with their early interest in the cultivation of alchemy, science, and chemistry, had pretty advanced distillation technology compared to most of Europe in the 17th century. This meant when the Dutch would brew an unhopped, indifferent mixed grain or rye-heavy malt wine, which is really what beer is without the hops, or ale when it doesn't have a gruit, to stop that hard-won alcohol from simply all turning to vinegar, they would distill it. This means they would separate the alcohol from most of the water and make a stronger spirit, typically something around 50% alcohol. While the Celts in the same period and later turned to wooden barrels and peat to flavor their distilled spirits and make it into whiskey, the Dutch used the local juniper berries and often some other local herbs to deal with the uncongenial flavors of their boring malt wines, and thus created Genever. In the 18th century, emerging technology and increased sugar production would start to replace Genever with gin. Mixed fruit wines and crummy grape wines could also be distilled into medicinally useful and more ship-stable brandy wine, or burnt wine. This distilled spirit might also be called aquavitae, or eau de vie, Latin and French words for water of life, respectively. The naming convention typically depended on the process, the resulting quality, and the habits of the merchant. It was this roster of food and drink, farmyard and temperate weather focused, and the associated cooking habits and techniques that the 17th century Dutch colonists brought with them to New Amsterdam. The Dutch definitely took to the local maize crop and incorporated cornmeal breads, mushes, and succotash into their diets. But because they came with the knowledge, supplies, and seeds to farm with, New York farms and gardens grew up in very short order. Cows were tenderly imported on ships, usually with an attendant for every few cows, who earned bonuses when they arrived in a good, healthy condition. Instead of the English habit of taking chances with indentured servants culled from the unskilled laboring classes of London, the Dutch tended to sponsor young people with farming credentials who were in search of land to farm. Lower-skilled Dutch laborers did come over to do farm work, and fed-up sailors might jump ship with visions of settling down to life on a farm. But the relationship farm owners had with these workers tended more as employees rather than as purchased workers. Living conditions were usually more humane, one or two laborers living with a family, and large dairy-heavy meals would be shared by family and farm help alike. The colonial Dutch attitude about farm was that its growing and preparation was as much an essential part of the Dutch trading and colonial empire as were the furs, pepper, silk, eels, and sugar. So farming enterprises were sponsored and monitored by government entities to ensure they were doing their part and contributing meaningfully to the Dutch project, and not squandering lives through poor feeding or unnecessary armed conflicts with the local inhabitants. Industrious production and temperate actions were the name of the game in North America. Rules could be, and often were, a bit different where plantation-scale production of sugar and spices were occurring. During the second half of the 20th century forward, a long project to uncover and make available records of the Dutch settlements in New York have been underway. As a result, much more of what the Dutch ate, how they cooked it, and how fancy that cooking got in America is now available. And it's clear that some of the things we think of as quintessentially American are deeply rooted in Dutch cultural and culinary traditions. Let's start with one of the most American cooking vessels, the Dutch oven. Before they were given the Dutch moniker, these were generically known as bake kettles. And unlike the low-maintenance cast iron models we've generally used since the late 18th century, the early versions were often made of what was called bell metal. This means they were either brass, which is an alloy of copper and zinc, or bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. The important part is these were pots that were smaller than the large cauldrons, and they came with covers, so could be easily used for small baking without having to go through the whole process of heating up a stone or brick oven. And the Dutch were doing more baking, and they were doing it earlier than the English colonists were. With their more sophisticated and decentralized trade networks, they imported wheat, and with the Hudson Valley farmland, a wheat-friendly climate combined with the importing of actual farmers, they also grew wheat much sooner and more successfully than the English, who were using most of their wheat-friendly land for growing tobacco. The Dutch had cows earlier and were more likely to raise dairy herds, since raising dairy products to trade for grain had been a very common farming profession back in Old Amsterdam. That means they had butter for making pastry and plenty of milk and cream for rich puddings. The Dutch also brought sugar to New Amsterdam in much larger quantities, much earlier than the English did to their Atlantic colonies. While the English insisted on the model of trade like spokes of a rimless wheel, where everything had to go in and out of London, the Dutch thought it was much more sensible for a ship coming up from Dutch South America or the Dutch Caribbean to stop through New Amsterdam and sell some sugar and lemons, while also picking up beaver pelts and maybe replenishing ship stores. As a trading empire, the Dutch were much less picky about what ports their ships stopped at, and didn't get quite as sniffy as the English Admiralty did at its merchants for trading with whoever gave the best price. As a result, a 17th century Dutch cookbook, The Sensible Cook, used in the Hudson Valley, contains recipes for a lemon tart, along with instructions for sausage and tripe rolls. A buttery wheat pastry stuffed with pork sausage or tripes are also given space. And it contains the things that seem the most American of all: oliekoek, waffles, pannenkoeken, and koekje. As I've mentioned a few times, while there was pan frying and fricassee in 17th century English colonies, there was not, as far as I have seen, any deep fat frying. This was not a common English technique at the time, except possibly for some celebratory or very fancy fried pies. The Dutch, with their intensive meat farming practices, with a concentration more on local consumption rather than the English tendency for industrial production for naval stores, meant homes tended to have personal stores of lard and beef suet. The cool North Atlantic climate was pretty favorable for keeping fats from going rancid, but probably most importantly, in cooking fuel strapped Holland, frying bread things, especially in smaller meal-sized quantities, was more fuel efficient than baking them. Holland had a communal bread baking tradition, sure, the village bake oven for large batch baking, but for home bread things making, the Dutch also had techniques that made sense over a cooking fire, as the peas soup boiled, the fowl stewed, or a hutspot cooked all day long. As a result, a small item, oliekoek or oil cakes, what we would recognize as a donut hole, was fried in lard or beef suet and was a fast way to make bread. And if sugar and spices were on hand, a dessert. So the donut, half of its American origins lie in the brass pots of Dutch lard in 17th century Manhattan. Waffles were another handy way to cook bread things without going full bread oven. The waffle iron, a long-handled device that had carved fancy patterns that could be filled with a batter of flour, eggs, and butter, and maybe sugar and spices when things were getting fancy, could be toasted over a fire until the batter was cooked. Once again, no long oven heating was necessary. And this was the type of cooking chore a small child could do alongside the preparation of a main meal. And then there's the pannenkoeken, or as we know it, the pancake. This was a fairly thick and large pancake that would be made on a griddle or in a long-handled frying pan or in a spider skillet. The large size of these made them convenient for the communal style eating at most colonial tables. People could tear off a piece as it was placed in the middle of the table. This particular style of making a bread thing without the use of an oven was to become one of the most popular open fire and later stovetop Dutch items. The sheer ease and practicality of the pancake, especially in light of the cookware available to everyone, likely meant it was the item that spread the furthest and fastest from the Dutch settlement all over America. One result of the ongoing popularity of the pancake is that many an American traveling in modern Holland is comforted by the pancakes of many thicknesses and diameters, sweet or savory, available for any meal of the day and for all the snacks. The last item, and the biggest break with English tradition, is the koekje, or little cake. While every English colonist in the 17th century and beyond said biscuits for little rolls or little cakes, biscuit could not escape its association with the iron-hard and generally unpleasant ship's biscuits, sometimes with maggots. In the 18th century, the Dutch baking tradition, with its better access to sugar and wheat and spices, would start to elbow out sweet biscuit in American English cooking vocabulary. And so, the American cookie would be born. The Dutch cookies of this era were generally made to showcase spices more than they were sugar, so the speculoos koekje was the show-off baked good of the 17th century. You can sample basically this at Trader Joe's with all their speculoos stuff, or through the Biscoff cookie on many an airplane. Okay, with that hefty dose of Dutch history and the answer to the cookie question, I'll stop part 1 of our Dutch detour. Next episode, we'll look at meat cookery from both land and sea, where frying will make a return appearance. I'll also spend some time on the dairy traditions and look at the roots of the New York dairy industry, and take a little more time to talk about how the international cosmopolitan soul of New York was laid down by the 17th century Dutch, and share the instance of the first recorded kosher butcher on the island of Manhattan. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really does make a difference and helps me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and a link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio @THOA Food and in the show description.